Hello, everyone. I wanted to finish up our discussion of the Ignorant Schoolmaster book with the final chapter, The Emancipator and His Monkey. So, kind of an inflammatory title there. We will see where he goes with this. Rancière and Jacques. I think the main theme here, and really the theme of the book all along, has been this idea of convincing the ignorant of their power. So instead of seeing a teacher as a superior being and the student as an inferior being, or the student is needing to catch up to the teacher or anything like that. We want to really rein in on this idea of equality, everyone having an equal level of intelligence. And he gives lots of examples of this, and throughout the book, the idea of stultification, all the bad things that can happen when people become convinced that they lack intelligence or that they're unable to learn on their own, all of the opportunities that gives for inequality in a society. And on page 101, he talks about the problem is not to create scholars. That's kind of a nice admission there. So we're not trying to create little mini Rancières, as it were. Rather, it's a little simpler than that, right? Just raising up people to believe, who believe themselves to be inferior in intelligence, to make them leave the swamp where they are stagnating. Not the swamp of ignorance, but the swamp of self-contempt, of contempt in and of itself for the reasonable creature. It is to make emancipated and emancipating people. And so I thought that was a good point to make. So somebody that goes through this process of universal teaching or intellectual emancipation, it's not that they become these scholars, these sort of know-it-all experts or scholars or anything like that, but they're convinced that they could become, an expert or a scholar or apply their intelligence to whatever end they desired, that they wouldn't feel like they're incapable or that they lack that capacity. And I think that's a worthy goal for any teacher, frankly. Then he kind of reins in on this idea, too, about you can't legislate this. He gives some examples of where Jacques was invited by Frederick the Great to sort of introduce some of these learning or teaching principles to the army. Frederick the Great had this very innovative army for the time. But they come back to this idea that it's really up to the individuals. Remember, all individuals are describing a parabola around the truth. Truth can be felt, but not necessarily articulated, right? So if you kind of expand that idea a little bit, you, I think, can arrive at this conclusion that you can't have a party, a government can't do it, an army can't do it, and there's no school or institution that can promote what Rancière has in mind. And so that's kind of an interesting point to wrap your head around, right? Even if you read The Ignorant Schoolmaster and you're on fire with this idea of universal teaching, you can't just go to a university, get some kind of a curriculum reform passed, and voila, you're emancipating people. You can't do that according to Rancière and Jacques. No institution can. There's a little quip I like there about Jacques had better things to do than fabricate second lieutenants, a type that will never be lacking in any society. So I'll pause here and let you give your thoughts on this idea, and kind of wondering too, if this is true, then what can we do as teachers and members of an institution? And here's a few other points that I thought were really nice from this passage, or from this chapter rather. Universal teaching will not be established in society. But on the other hand, it will not perish because it is the natural method of the human mind, that of all people who look for their path themselves. And he gives some examples there of these sort of gentleman scientists of the, I guess that would have been the 18th century, people like Isaac Newton, for example. So they weren't learning what they needed from schools or universities, sort of or reading books or whatever. They had to set up their own experiments, learn these things on their own, and that's how they discovered these truths, right? But for the same reason, you can't just say, okay, well, Isaac Newton discovered these truths, so let's put it all into a textbook and teach, and the students can learn from that. The idea is that the students would have to have a similar process that Newton followed, right? You can't just sort of take that regurgitated knowledge and just swallow it down and be emancipated that way. The only way to emancipate yourself is to learn things on your own, to follow your own path. And there's another interesting thought kind of connected to the previous one. The government doesn't owe people an education. for the simple reason that one doesn't owe people what they can take for themselves. He talks about liberty in the same context, right? You sort of, liberty is something you have to take for yourself. You can't be given liberty. And it sounds like Rancière would say the same thing about an education. And I think this is very much true. You think about students that you might have that seem to want to be very passive in the classroom. They just kind of want to sit there like there's some kind of a receptacle for knowledge, not really active at all. And, what could a government do to change that? I don't know. I don't know what you could do. If the student just doesn't want to be active, doesn't have that will to learn, I don't know what you could do or anybody could do. And then he adds to this, only an emancipated person is untroubled by the idea that the social order is entirely conventional. Only he can scrupulously obey superiors that he knows are his equals. So I thought this is kind of an interesting idea as well, because one of the things about this radical equality that I guess might bother people, especially think about an army context, where you have second lieutenants and captains or infantry or whatever. If the infantry person thinks that he or she is an equal to the sergeant and to the lieutenants and the generals or whatever, everything would break down, right? It'd be anarchy again. But Rancière and Jacques seem to be suggesting that actually, no, if you're intellectually emancipated, then you're kind of you sort of see the situation as a necessary evil, as it were. You're willing to go along with it because you realize that the alternative would be a lot worse, right? So I thought I would, again, I'll pause here and let you respond to these 3 points. I want to know what you make of them and where we can go with them if you agree with them. I think he talks a little, he's got a little section there called Men of Progress, People of Progress. This idea of progress is very important in our society. You think about technological progress and so on. We seem like we're so much more advanced than the people in the 1800s, let's say, or the 1900s even, or even the 1990s for that matter. We always feel like we're making all this progress, right? And Rancière says that progress is the pedagogical fiction built into the fiction of the society as a whole. It represents inequality as a retard in one's development, so something that slows you down, right? So we've kind of got all these people that are making all this progress, and some people are not making the progress, right? So we want to say, there must have been stunted somehow. They're clinging to the old ways or whatever it is. And Rancière says that's not the right view, right? You need to see what's really going on here. It's I guess the powers that be are the ones that are always at the lead of this race towards progress, right? And they're always going to be there. And the people will always be struggling to follow this lead, right? He says the student will never catch up to the master, nor the people with its enlightened elite. But the hope of getting there makes them advance along the good road, one of perfected explications, right? And he says, the perfecting of instruction is thus first the perfecting of tethers, or rather the perfecting of the representation of the usefulness of tethers. And he talks later on about these tethers being kind of the university degrees people feel like they need to have. It used to be that you only needed to go to college for a very small number of careers, right? Lawyers, well, I forget the list, but like medical doctors and so on. Things I think we can all see the value in it. But it seems like now, I would say even more so than when this book was written, it seems like there's this idea out there that to get any kind of decent job, no matter what the field, you need a college degree. And so you had to enter into this university situation with all that it entails, these tethers, as it were. And you probably know people that know a whole lot about whatever it is they do in their profession, right? But the fact that they don't have this degree prevents them from catching up, as it were, to those other people that are, enlightened seems not the right word to use there, but I guess the people with the degrees seem to have an advantage that has very little to do with how much they actually know or how well they perform, right? It's just they've gone further into the system, right? They're a higher place on this hierarchy that's really kind of worthless in a lot of cases, frankly. I guess Rancière would say that's quite by design. Then he talks about the the natural method goes into a little more detail about what this would entail. So I thought I would just read this little passage here. So he's talking about this universal teaching method, and I'm trying to think, as I was reading this, what kind of methods are out there? What kind of tools are there? Not necessarily in a classroom situation, but maybe online or whatever you could imagine, right? So how could you sort of provide resources to help with this method? Anyway, a natural method that respects the intellectual development of the child, all the while procuring for his mind the best of gymnastics. An active method that makes him habituated to reasoning for himself and confronting difficulties alone, that creates self-assurance in speech and a sense of responsibility. So that all seems to make sense, right? And then he says a good classical foundation. And this is where it gets a little complex to me. What exactly does he mean by that? Good classical education. He's talking about like the trivium and the quadrivium. He says, learning language at the school of the great writers, disdaining grammarians' jargon, a practical and expeditious method that does away with the costly and interminable stages of college to form enlightened and industrious young people ready to launch themselves into careers useful for the perfecting of society. And as I was reading this, I was reminded of some of the advice I've read in guides to writing fiction, like Stephen King's book on writing. There's a lot of these sort of books, and a lot of those books kind of have the same idea, right? You don't need to go to college to learn this stuff. Just find great novels, or I guess best-selling novels, whatever, and really apply yourself to studying those, imitating those. You don't need to learn all this sort of jargon that you might learn in a college classroom, right? It's autodidactic, learn on your own system. I also thought about games again. I know I've mentioned video games several times reading this, but you think about how you learn to play a video game versus how you might learn to do trigonometry in a traditional classroom setting, right? Very different kinds of learning, and I guess for Rancière, he would say that second type is not even learning, right? It's just stultification. So I wonder if you could come up with more examples, or maybe help me flesh this idea out a little bit more about what Rancière, what this natural method would look like. And then to wrap up here, I like this wonderful passage. I guess this is taken from one of Jacques Attou's works, and it goes something like this. Seek the truth, and you will not find it. Knock at its door, and it will not open to you. But that search will serve you in learning to do. Stop drinking at that fountain, but don't, for all that, stop trying to drink. Come and we will make our poetry. It's a storyteller who never runs out of stories. And so I love that imagery there. The old master is never content. He lifts up a mask, rejoices, but his joy doesn't last long, and so on until the end of all truth seekers. The lifting of those superimposed masks is what we call the history of philosophy. Oh, the beautiful history. I like the Panacastic stories better. That Panacasts are, everything is in everything, is I think how that roughly translates. So, I'm wondering, at this point, now that we finished the book, what do we make of this approach, this focus on intellectual emancipation? And everyone's equally intelligent. All this information and thoughts about stultification and how things can go so horribly wrong. It's not like these old school teachers, these school masters are evil necessarily. I guess some probably are, but that's certainly not their intention to be stultifying, right? I think a lot of teachers, including myself and probably you as well, I like to think of ourselves as emancipating students, right? Not holding ourselves up as some kind of superior beings to them. But maybe Rancière and Jacques Attou are right. Maybe we kind of unconsciously slip into these mindsets from time to time. But anyway, I'll leave it there. And as we get into our other readings for the course, we'll be reading about pop culture in the classroom, more about critical digital literacy and all these things. And I hope that Rancière's lessons will always be in the back of our minds as we read about all these different approaches, new methods, innovations in education. So thank you very much for listening again.